Go. Hello, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar and featured film. I'm Michael Frederick, Executive Director of the Thoreau Society. I am here at Thoreau Farm in the birth room of Henry David Thoreau. This weekend, we're hosting a series of webinars that we're calling There is More Day to Dawn, a global conversation celebrating Thoreau's lasting legacy, sponsored by the Thoreau Society. Today's noontime panel is the Global Thoreau Community, a Conversation Part 2, with interviewer Rebecca Gould and guest speakers Henrik Otterberg from Sweden, Brian Bartlett from Canada, Antonio Casado de Rocha from Spain, Bergur Þorgeirsson from Iceland. Rebecca Gould is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. A scholar of comparative religion, Gould's research and writing looks back on 19th century when pondering the legacies of Emerson and Thoreau, and forward to the 21st century when examining the promise and limits of various forms of religiously based environmental advocacy. Gould is the author of At Home in Nature, Modern Homesteading and Spiritual Practice in America, and co-creator with director Phil Walker of The Fire Inside, Place, Passion, and the Primacy of Nature. Henrik Otterberg is an economist from Gothenburg, Sweden. He wrote his PhD on Thoreau's aesthetics, serves on the Thoreau Society Board of Directors, and acts as a bibliographer for the Thoreau Society Bulletin, our quarterly publication. Brian Bartlett is a Canadian poet and prose writer who has published 7 collections and 7 chapter books of poetry, a selection of his prose about poetry, and 2 books of nature, writing, Ringing Here and There, a Nature Calendar, and Branches Over Ripples, a waterside journal, with another volume, Day Start Song Flight, a morning journal currently being revised. Brian taught creative writing in various fields of literature at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, for nearly 3 decades before retirement 2 years ago. Antonio Casado de Rocha is a Thoreau Society member since 1995 when he got in touch with Walter Harding. He has translated into Spanish Thoreau's Walking and Civil Disobedience, as well as a selection of his writings on writing. In 2005, he published the first Thoreau biography in Spanish, and in 2017, Una Casa en Walden, a collection of essays. He worked as outreach director at the University of the Basque Country. Finally, Bergur Þorgeirsson is a literary scholar and medievalist and studied at the University of Iceland and the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, Göteborg. He works as the director of Snorrastofa, a cultural and medieval research center in West Iceland dedicated to the Icelandic medieval writer, poet, and chieftain Snorri Sturluson. He mainly studies the Old Icelandic Fornlífsögur and Eddic poetry. He is also doing research on the reception of Old Icelandic literature in the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th. Welcome, guests. Welcome, attendees.
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. And Mike, I just want to say a big thank you to you and to everybody that's been involved in this webinar series. I think we all feel, last weekend we had a discussion about loss, and we all feel the loss of not being able to gather together in Concord, and yet these webinar sessions have been so incredibly rich, and yesterday's collection of sessions was so wonderful. So I feel not dissimilarly, even though I miss being in Concord and miss being with people personally. I went to bed last night with my mind just rolling on various things and woke up this morning ready for more, which is exactly how I feel when I'm there. So I can't thank you and so many others for making this possible. And it's a privilege to be here this afternoon. And I'm going to just say a few things to help orient our audience to this conversation as well as the panelists. I hope we get Henrik back here, but we'll just proceed ahead until he connects back in. So yesterday, Jane Gordon led a beautiful discussion about, it was the Global Conversation Part 1, and really asking the members of the panel, as I will ask today, to not simply talk about Thoreau, so much as to talk about how Thoreau is resonating in their lives right now in this current moment, this moment of pandemic, this moment of political disruption and reorientation, and whatever these moments are in people's very personal and private lives. So we're going to be doing another version of that today with our guests representing different countries and different experiences. And really the underlying theme throughout, I hope, will be really, how are you walking, even if not physically, at least metaphorically, with Thoreau in these moments that we've been in? And do you feel companioned by him is another way we might ask these questions. Are you helped by connecting with Thoreau in these times? And or if you're like me and you love Thoreau but argue with him, what kinds of arguments might you be having? So I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about sort of the lenses through which we might do that. But by way of opening and also introducing yourselves to this broad audience that I think we have today, I'm going to ask each of you to say a little bit about how you first connected with Thoreau. How did you first find out about him? What was the first thing that you read? Where was that? What was that first encounter like? Briefly, because that could be a lifelong story, of course. And then also to say something so we all know about how things are for you right now on the ground, including where physically you are, not just what country, but what region, help us locate you on the map, and then what life has been like for you. And then we'll come back and enrich and deepen that conversation in various ways. So I'm going to just sort of do this in the order that works best on my screen. So Antonio, can we start with you, and then I'll call on Brian, and after that, Bergur.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for being here. It's wonderful to keep this conversation on, and this way to stay connected in this space that we are creating around Thoreau's words and Thoreau's deeds. We began talking about loss, and I think Henrik is still lost. I hope he comes back. In the introduction, Mike mentioned that I got in touch with Walter Harding because I had translated Civil Disobedience by Thoreau. And what happened afterwards is that I continued my translation work with walking, and then I got in touch with Brad Dean. I wanted to start by remembering Brad because for me, he was a big mentor. And I think he will have loved this. I mean, this being in touch with each other by means of technology and this Zoom thing that we are now so used to, he will have loved it because he was a kind of pioneer in digital humanities and Thoreau studies in general. I was very privileged. I feel privileged today to be here, also to be, at home with my family. We haven't had any losses around. But I also was very privileged because I was able to walk in Thoreau country, there in Concord and Lincoln. So that's when I did most of my Thoreau work. I've been living on that fat ever since. But for me, it started when I was 18. There was a conscription army here in Spain. I wasn't very enthusiastic about joining the army. At that time, I was reading Edgar Allan Poe, but I discovered that there was another New Englander that had something to say. Even though Edgar Allan Poe in these times of pandemic is an interesting read in itself, The Mask of Red Death and all that. So I got into Thoreau by means of Civil Disobedience, but that brought me to Walden and the journals, of course. I think this might be enough. I have mentioned that we are well. I live very close to nature. So during these months, I've been more in touch with nature than probably in my whole life. But I missed the conversation. So, well, I think we can talk about this later on.
Yeah, and that's a great start, Antonio, partly because some of the discussion yesterday that I'm sure will come again today is, have you been able to be in contact with nature in this time, and how has that fed you, if it has? Brian, you're up next. If you could say a little bit about how you first encountered Thoreau, and also share with the audience a little bit about what life is like for you, where you are, what you've been dealing with, as a kind of an opener, and then we'll come back and thicken some of that.
Okay, well, I'm here as a Canadian, and of course, don't have any genetic connection to Alex Therian, but he is called a Canadian in the chapter in Walden Visitors. I cannot claim that I eat woodchuck or that I can pound in 50 posts a day as he could, though I've been known to do a few Facebook posts now and then. Thoreau, I brought a little show and tell. Thoreau's Walden, the first copy of it that I bought, which I dug out last night, as you'll see, I bought in 1967. And in St. John, which was a city about 100 miles from my hometown. And I was at that time a kind of bookworm naturalist who spent a lot of time in the woods. And the book hit me very powerfully as unlike anything I had read before. I was kind of amused last night to realize that if I show some pages here, that I think this may have been the first book that I ever underlined passages in, which I think says something for Thoreau's epigrammatical style. But you'll notice that I appear to, and I'd totally forgotten this, I appear to have used a ruler in underlining passages, which I don't believe I ever did again with any other book. But considering Thoreau as the surveyor and the man of exact measurements and so on, it seemed like an appropriate thing to do. And I did notice as well the first questioning of Thoreau, if you can see the question mark in the margin there, right there. And interestingly, that was next to the line, I have lived for some 30 years on this planet, and I've never yet to hear the first syllable of valuable or even earnest advice from my seniors. So I think I had a good enough home life and respected my parents and grandparents enough that I was at the age of 13, pulling myself back a bit from that particular don't trust anyone under 30 view of Thoreau's. In my current life, one thing I've been thinking about with Thoreau is certainly Thoreau and gratitude. It seems to me he was a writer who often felt and expressed gratitude for many things. He did speak about being luckier than most people he knew, and a sense of beatitude or just of good fortune. I think even though he suffered a lot and had extreme difficulties and lived in a very vexed time in American history, nonetheless, I think he had a great capacity for gratitude. And I've been thinking about that in the last couple of months, just personally with having retired 2 years ago has put me in a privileged position compared to my ex-colleagues. My children, who are 19 and 22, are now living back under our roof, which is a comforting thing to have. I had a very long handwritten manuscript completed last November, so I've been able to dig into that and type that up, which has perhaps been easier than writing from scratch. So it has given me focus for creativity. And one other thing is that I think we can all in this part of the world be, I think, glad that the pandemic hit in late winter into spring. Because I've said to a couple of people, imagine if this had started in late fall leading into winter. You know, at least we have had the, and again, Thoreau and the seasons, at least we've had the sense of regeneration and rebirth and flowering and migrant birds returning and so on, which has provided a healthy, I don't know if we can say hopeful kind of contrast to the sense of doom and fatedness and worry into the future.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. And both of you have given us rich starting points through which to continue some of what we're going to discuss. Bergur, would you like to go next? And after that, we'll hear from Henrik a little bit about how you first encountered Thoreau and a little bit about what's going on in life for you right now in Iceland. And Brian, I just have to say, I think Thoreau would have loved the fact that you used a ruler.
Well, I first encountered Henrik Otterberg before I encountered Thoreau. So I got to know Henrik in 1995, I think, when he was an opponent in the studies that I was studying in Gothenburg concerning Old Icelandic literature. And he was an opponent to a paper that I presented. And he was very kind to me. So we became friends, and he was trying to write something about Bellman, I think. But he always talked about Thoreau, nothing else. So that's the reason why I got to know Thoreau. That's through Henrik Otterberg. And I'm very thankful. I didn't think very much about Thoreau afterwards, but in the year of 2008, when the big economic crash hit Iceland, the economic meltdown, people cited Thoreau quite a lot in the resistance against the government and against the bankers here in Iceland. It was very important because people talked all the time about civil disobedience and so on. People were having protests by the parliament in Reykjavik. So, but I've been looking at Thoreau from the eyes of Snorri Sturluson, of course, and from Reykjavik, where I live here in Western Iceland. And I'm mainly looking at what Thoreau is writing about Old Icelandic literature or Old Norse literature, mainly the king sagas of Scandinavia and the Norse mythology. And this is a fascinating topic because it's not just positive about Thoreau, but also shows us Thoreau's, how Thoreau is naive towards that culture, the Viking culture, which he talks very much about and quite in a positive way. He looks at the Vikings as some free individuals and so on. But as you know, they were all kinds of people. So I want to do some work around that because I'm looking in general at the reception of Old Icelandic literature in the 19th century, like Michael said in the beginning. And I've been looking at the Norwegian Americans and how they were treating Snorri Sturluson. And it's very interesting to compare what the Norwegians are saying about the Vikings and their heritage compared to men like Emerson and Thoreau. Talking about the pandemic here in Iceland, we've been quite lucky. We are on an island, we are isolated. We got quite a lot of cases in the beginning, maybe just under 2,000 cases, 10 deaths, but we've been able to have most of the things open and we are not wearing masks or anything. There have been no instances in many days, so we don't have much of this pandemic left here in Iceland, but we are isolated, of course, and we're not allowed to travel to other countries and so on. The country is going to be opened on Monday for tourists, and it will be very interesting if that is possible without getting a second wave. But I've been, I live, of course, in the country, and we have what we call woods here in Reykholt, which have been getting quite large. And I walk every day in the woods for maybe 6 to 12 kilometers every day. And I very often have Thoreau on my ears when I'm walking. So time flies when I'm walking in the woods listening to Thoreau. And I could talk all day about the influence Thoreau is having on me.
Thank you. And we'll get back to definitely opportunities to say more about that. Henrik, last but certainly not least, in your capacity as the person who introduced Bergur to Thoreau, and I am very indebted to you over the many years, not that many, but they seem so rich since we first met each other in Concord, and to meet someone Concord better than I do, I think, and I lived there for a while, has been wonderful. If you could say a little bit about your first encounter and a little bit about how things are for you now, and then I'll bring us into some more focused questions. I'm seeing a lot through the side eye about love and gratitude in Thoreau's work, so I just wanted to name that. Those are things of great interest to me, as some of the things that we also might weave into our conversation. Go ahead, Henry.
Yes, thank you. I guess well, listening to Brian and Antonio, and a confluence really. We have a conscription army system in Sweden. Somehow that I wished to do a sort of a weapons-free service. Instead, I ended up a fireman, but that's another story. But civil disobedience was really formative, and Antonio's experience. But then, as chance would have it, a couple of years later, I did not know at this time, as it were, of the literary Thoreau or very much about him beyond civil disobedience. My mother, Kerstin, a reading person all her life, as was my maternal grandmother, she put into my hands a copy of the very edition of Wall of the 60s that Brian just showed us, with a wonderful cover. That I was in business school, so it was a very dangerous gift. And I did complete, yes, that's the very one. Well, my journey with Thoreau, is the preeminent expert on the cover art of Walden. We'll hope to see that study sometime. That would be very lovely. But I guess, as many, my trajectory, I encountered Thoreau fairly young. So for a time, for a fairly long time, actually, I felt he had all the right answers to things I was thinking about. And now, many years later, I'd perhaps phrase it that I think that he poses all the right. They remain with me. So, otherwise, I'm located here in Gothenburg on Sweden's west coast. We're a town of slightly less than 600,000 people. So I thought I'd make a comparison with New York City, which has been very much in the news lately. So our entire country of about 10 million people is about 55% of New York City's. However, our area is larger, so you don't have that density. Of course, if in kilometers square there are 24,000 people in the metro area of New York City, here in Gothenburg we're just under 1,300. So of course, a country of the strategy here is towards herd immunity, even though you won't perhaps hear the politicians say so outright, but that really has been the strategy. Very little testing. People wear masks. We're encouraged, of course, to observe social and I don't want to in any way put our own strategy. It's probably doubtful whether one strategy is and before this has been analyzed correctly, but it's been open. Like Bergur, I enjoy evening walks. I live reasonably close to a nature park area, and for the first time since I was a child, I've been able to observe much spring and now summer. So it's a lovely gift. It's a very strange time. I lost a good friend just my age who had an underlying condition, but it was a very sure. So yeah, there are many emotions. Hard to say, given the, of course, grateful that I myself and my closest family and so on have thus far survived and are well. So in that sense,
Thank you, Henrik. I'm just going to cut you off because I hear that you're close to wrapping up, and also there is a little audio lag, but I think we've caught most of what you were sharing. And if you feel like you didn't quite get something out there, also there's also you can do. I wanted to make one quick remark and then just give you a quotation that I'm sure you're all quite familiar with from Walden to just ponder and to ask, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all four of you, but if some of you, whether and how this resonates, this is more the contemplative Thoreau. I want to talk a little bit about the contemplative Thoreau and how he is resonating in your life. And then also, given especially what's been happening in the streets in the past 3 weeks in my country, but I know resonating outward in so many fascinating ways globally, to talk about Thoreau and action, particularly resistance. And what struck me in saying that also is that for some of you, you came to Thoreau the resistor first. And I found that really interesting because for most of my students, they mostly know the quote unquote Walden hermit. They have all kinds of stereotypes about what that means. And many of them have not read Slavery in Massachusetts or Resistance to Civil Government until I asked them to read it. And then sometimes what they say is, oh my gosh, is this the same person? Which I say, yes, it is. So it struck me as quite interesting that for some of you, that was your way in, partly because of your own resistance choices. But let's step back to contemplation for a moment. And I would like to read this from the economy chapter of Walden. In any weather, at any hour of the day or night, I have been anxious to improve the nick of time and notch it on my stick too, to stand on the meeting of two eternities, the past and the future, which is precisely the present moment, to toe that line. That passage, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, has always struck me as so remarkable there's so much discussion today about being in the present and mindfulness, at least in many of the circles that I'm in. And here is Thoreau in the mid-19th century saying, how do I do this? How do I let go of the past and not worry about the future and really make it my mission to be in the present moment? So if that passage resonates for any of you, or to how you're taking Thoreau with you in your lives right now, I'd love to hear some reflections. Maybe that's what's happening in your walks or in other ways. Does anyone want to go first in response to that passage? Or maybe I'll just call on you. Antonio, why don't you start?
Sure. Absolutely, Rebecca. The Walden passage I have selected to share with you is also about time. Is the one at the beginning of Sounds, when he says that I grew in those seasons like corn in the night, meaning, you know, those times when he did nothing. And this being in the present at the same time with a future that is most uncertain has definitely been, you know, our way of being during these months. But at the same time, I've been extremely busy these months. As many of you, I work in education, and this has been a tremendous disruption. I've been working at home more than usually, but at the same time, I have had a strange independence. I've been able to push a few things. I think in many ways, this disruption has given us an opportunity or even an alibi to leave some things behind and to face changes that perhaps were beginning to take place or waiting for us to take place. And in that sense, I have embraced change. University is a very conservative institution in many ways, but for us academics, this terrible situation has forced us to, at least has forced me to think about what is my job, what I am doing, what should we doing, and in what ways we should transform our economies, our ways of traveling around, for instance, to make it better. So in a way, contemplation has been for me very close to action, but I took some kind of license, you know, the license of a higher order of beings that Thoreau writes about in Walden. For instance, to read. I have been reading a lot, and normally I don't really have much time to read.
Thank you for that. And I definitely resonate with some of what you're saying. For those of us who teach or recently retired from teaching and work with young people, this moment has really asked us to think really long and hard about what is it that we're doing and why we're doing it and how we can serve future generations. And I think for me too, all of those questions have become more lively and more acute in this time. Henrik, would you like to say anything about that quote if it speaks to you?
I think it's interesting. We all know the fable of the ant and the grasshopper, and this particular quote, philosophy, if you will, sort of unabashedly asking or prompting us to be present in the moment, whereas we are, well, at least speaking broadly of Sweden and Swedish mentality, we're also a product. You know, save a stitch in time and so on. So this must have been thinking of the philosophical time. I, of course, find it very apt in these strange times to value the moment. an endless amount of moments will recur and opportunities. At the same time, we all do have a bit of the ant in us, don't we? And the trajectory of this pandemic has, forced us in different directions, sort of between those poles, seeing up our larders or whatnot. But it remains a lovely sentiment, so succinct and resonating, I think. That's a lovely quote.
Bergur and Brian, just to expand it out, not necessarily to have everyone reflect on that quote, but both of you spoke about being in nature, having more time to be attentive to the natural world. Maybe Brian, you got a little lead time there on your retirement to be able to do that. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more on the connections between the time that we're in, the time you've been able to have in nature, and whether and how Thoreau feeds the contemplative life in you, especially when I think of a poet really needs to have a contemplative life in order to write poetry. At least that's been my experience with the poetry I write that I never share to anybody. So Brian, maybe you first.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've been thinking of in the last month or two is that I don't know how many of you read the book Quiet by, was it Susan, about introversion and extroversion, which argues that everybody is somewhere on the introversion extroversion panorama, but certainly some of us are more toward the introversion side. And it's been occurring to me that, in some ways the pandemic has probably been a lot easier for introverts than for extroverts, because introverts, of which I think we can classify Thoreau as being one, value solitude, value privacy, can find society more readily overwhelming and overbearing and just dizzying than more extroverted people do. And one passage in Thoreau, brief passage I want to read that struck me just this morning. In Solitude, he says, "Some of my pleasantest hours were during the long rainstorms in the spring and fall, which confined me to the house for the afternoon as well as the forenoon, soothed by the ceaseless roar and pelting, when at early twilight ushered in a long evening in which many thoughts had to take root and unfold themselves." And there's so many, interesting things in that, where he often, when he uses the word confined, it's a very negative thing. He wants to break away from confinement. He resists confinement. People confined in their desperate lives. But here he's quite comforted in being confined. And curiously, as other people have commented, he refers to his building, his little building, as a house, which I think is the most typical way he refers to it. Does he ever refer to it as a hut, which is often our way of referring to it, but I don't think he ever used the word hut. And maybe he used hut once or twice, but cabin, which people often talk about Thoreau's cabin. I don't think he used the word cabin. Jeff may be able to answer that in the comments. I think he knows. So that, that idea of confinement, this is a kind of soothing. He says soothing, soothed by the ceaseless storm. And notice that he is indoors. He's not outside. So he so often expresses the feeling of being at home. His natural element is outside in the elements. But here he is in, as he puts it, the pleasure of being indoors and in confinement. So he had that strength as well. And there's, again, it's so easy to overemphasize the 2 years, 2 months and 2 days by Walden Pond, that most of his years were not spent that way. His room was the attic, the upper room in the family house. And he spent a lot of time in that attic up in the house with his sisters and his mothers down below, making the meals and performing the music. He felt very at home in that environment. You know, one aspect of Thoreau's life that I sometimes wish he had written about a little bit more in Walden, if at all, is that life. It's off the stage. It's not there. And I think it would have added an interesting contrast or an authenticity that would have only deepened the powers of the rest of the book.
I just want to add in connection to that I think Huey's film, Thoreau, Surveyor of the Soul, which is being shown or accessible tonight and then discussed, and Laura Dasso-Wall's brilliant biography, that both of those, and you know, there are many other scholars that but at least in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen much more attention to Thoreau's social life, the networks, especially of women who are important to him. And so much else of that is being filled in research, even if it's not all directly referred to by Thoreau. Bergur, thoughts about the contemplative life, the quote, your times walking, anything you want to add to this part of our conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been thinking very much about the situation today, of course, in the world, not just the pandemic, but also climate change and so on. And when you read Thoreau, you think very much about climate change. And it's very much discussed in my family and in my surroundings. One of the things that happened here in Iceland in connection with the pandemic is that the elites stopped the pandemic. So the Trumpists have been stopped in Iceland because the elites were able to show that by using science, you were able to stop the pandemic in Iceland. That's very important. I've also been thinking quite a lot, thinking very much about my own life when I'm listening to Thoreau and the sequence of my life from birth. And I'm really thinking about things like deep time and so on. Thing comes together. Also thinking about individuality and what Thoreau says about individuality and the connection between individuality and conscience and responsibility. This is also quite interesting, and it's very interesting to see how Thoreau is misused or misused in that context. Even your president in the United States quotes Thoreau when he's talking about right-wing militia taking charge in Michigan. I'm sorry to bring this up. I know it's taboo, but
I think it's even with the opening of the resistance to civil government and that government best which governs least, the way that phrase has been misused politically, when if you actually dig into the text, you see what Thoreau is actually saying. I'm conscious of time, even though we would like to all be sitting on our stoop as Thoreau did, growing like corn in the night. Mike, you can let me know. There's another direction I want to go, but maybe it's time to bring in the broader audience questions. How would you like to call it?
Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions and a few comments. Would you time-wise, do you think you can go for another 5 minutes with the group?
Let's challenge ourselves to be concise so that I can drop another quotation in your direction. Again, one that I think you're familiar with and most of our audience is too. And this is from Resistance to Civil Government. And given what's been going on in my country, some very, very powerful and largely nonviolent and largely very positive resistance. I've been rereading these pages in these last weeks. And this quotation, there are many one could pick, but struck me in particular when he's talking about his decision not to pay the tax, which led to his first night in jail. If 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure, as it would be to pay them and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. To me, this quotation resonates so much with the questions that are being asked and the resistance that has been in our streets in the last few weeks, and which is resonating differently, of course, for all of you who are not in the US right now. But if you've been paying attention to what's going on or thinking about versions of this in your own countries, I'd just be curious for a very brief reflection before we turn to some broader questions. I find that Thoreau has a lot to say to us about resistance in the moment that we're in. And I wonder if any of you would like to comment on what Thoreau is saying to you in this social and political moment.
Well, as a matter of fact, we are organizing here. Well, we have on July the 12th, a very important day for us Thoreauvians, we have a regional elections here. And there was a bitter debate about whether we can have the elections when, you know, everything has been so disrupted. But eventually there are elections, but a few citizens and neighbors and friends, we decided that, well, we wanted to have something else, and we organized a civil disobedience reading of Thoreau in a public park next July the 12th, and this way we will celebrate Thoreau's birthday too. I remember in one of the first webinars with Kristen Case, they mentioned relationships, and I think that the kind of contemplation that many of us have had during these weeks has been a contemplation of the interconnectedness of our world. Thoreau said, you know, the infinite extent of our relations. So in a way, the pandemic is about, you know, bad consequences of being so interlocked, all countries and economies, but there is also a positive side. I mean, we are conscious of things that are happening in the United States right now, and in a way we are thinking about this as a global community as well. In a way, this is not new, but I'm living it, I'm experiencing it in more than ever.
Thank you for that. And we've had on July 4th public readings of Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," but I like the idea of July 12th readings. Maybe get that going in the state of Vermont. Would anyone else like to respond?
Well, at least here in Iceland, people have been protesting because of Black Lives Matter in front of the parliament in Reykjavik. And the radio and the newspapers have been full of discussions about the racism which we can find in Iceland, just like in all other countries. So the situation in the United States has sparked great interest here in Iceland.
And I have to say that kind of global response is exceedingly inspiring to me.
Mm. Absolutely.
Brian, or?
Yeah, I was going to mention that I think one thing that Thoreau does come back to a few times in his writings is that I don't think he really sees that there is a single monolithic correct way of responding to crisis. He says a man has not everything to do but something. So you can't do everything, you can't be everyone, you can't wear all hats. And he says, I will quietly declare war with the state after my fashion. You know, totally typical of him to say after my fashion, quietly declare war against the state. Well, that was written, I think, before his John Brown speeches, in which I think were, I don't know, rabble-rousing, but vehement, certainly, in defense of John Brown. And so he had it in him to, I think, loudly declare war against the state but he also, this is a part of him that also kind of wanted to defend a quieter role. And as I say, he didn't see that every form of protest or resistance had to take the same form. His sister and his mother were very involved in signing petitions and so on, I believe. And I read somewhere recently that someone said that he poo-pooed that, and I'm not sure if that is the truth. I'd never seen that anywhere else, that he looked down on his mother and sister for forming petitions and signing them.
I think what some of what you hear from him is just a concern about people who become professional reformers and are so reforming that they're disrupting his life, including sometimes in his family, the disruption of all those reforms to the contemplation that he wanted. Even though he adored his family and approved of what they did.
Well, you know that photo that appeared in the last couple of weeks or so of the National Guard on the steps of the Washington Monument? There's this horrific, chilling picture of this bunch of National Guards who were all with masks on, and they were robotic, and just complete military might there. And it's, rereading so much of Thoreau, there are these things that jump out at us. And that happened the other day, thinking that image immediately came to mind when I read a common and natural result of an undue respect for is that you may see a file of soldiers, colonel, captain, corporal, privates, pound monkeys and all, marching in admirable order over hill and dale to the wars against their common sense and consciences, which makes it very steep marching indeed and produces a palpitation of the heart. And just thinking of the men, and I say in this case probably mostly men, behind those National Guard uniforms, how many of them had consciences? How many of them didn't want to be there, didn't want to be doing that? There must be some. There must be lots. Would be the optimistic thing to think.
I reread that sentence 2 nights ago myself.
Oh, okay.
Very, very similar.
Same thing. Yeah.
Mike, do we have time for Henrik to chime in here before we turn to the broader audience?
Sure. Go for it.
Well, I'd say basically policing situation. It's not quite the same as in the US, but certainly there are tensions. And many, I think, of these protests have also been made in sympathy with what is going on. Denmark in particular, and Norway, the reception of Thoreau Thoreau in the common understanding, if I guess I should use brackets, but as he's well known to people at large, it's very much the sensitive nature writer and the proponent of strategic retreat, sort of a pastoral writer, whereas in Denmark and Norway, particularly when Civil Disobedience was first translated there. Of course, the occupation, it's very different. I'd even venture so far as to include Finland here, although I don't have Finnish, I can say less about that. But it's interesting from region to region, Thoreau's reception varies and is different. So he's not part right now of the current discourse around police violence when it comes to green issues and concerns over global warming and so on here in Sweden.
Thank you for that. I want to turn it over to Michael Frederick now to field some questions that any of you might respond to, but I just want to say personally, what a rich conversation this has been. I wish we could go on longer. I also know that there are some great conversations happening in our virtual annual gathering that I'm sure Mike will give us the heads up about later this afternoon and this evening. So I hope many of us can be there so that some of the themes that we unfolded here, we can continue. And thank you to Jeff Wiesner and others who are posting, and Michael also, who are posting full references to some of what we've been discussing in the chat. Again, I've only had one little eye over there because I wanted to be present to this conversation, but I can tell you're filling in a lot, and that makes a professor very happy to see footnotes and references so that we can go back to the text themselves to see how they speak to us. So Michael.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Antonio, Brian, Bergur, and Henrik. This has been an enriching conversation, as Rebecca has said, and it's taken a turn where we're taking a look at current issues and issues around Thoreau's civil disobedience, which I've found very interesting, and would like to just quickly offer some of my own thoughts, looking forward to this afternoon's webinar on racism, disenfranchisement then and now, where we will be taking up some of these same issues again. So just looking at Thoreau's time, where he wrote an essay, Resistance to Civil Government, which later became known as Civil Disobedience. Thoreau, in that essay, really outlines an idea for peaceable revolution, which Gandhi and King picked up. Thoreau also qualified that statement, and he added a comma, and he said, if any such is possible. So this, for Thoreau, left open the window for what would become his essay on John Brown, which of course is related, goes all the way back to the US Constitution that had a fugitive slave law embedded in the language of the Constitution. And later, with the second fugitive slave law in 1850, that required every Northerner to actually participate, if called upon, to return a fugitive to the South. And this incensed the North, and of course, ultimately, I think, led to the Civil War. And we should also remember too that at the time, the United States is actually exporting 2/3 of the world's cotton. And this is at a time where the textile industry is really what's driving the Industrial Revolution, and that cotton is the primary source that's fueling the textile industry. So Thoreau's move to Walden Pond, I also like to tell students, is a form of resistance, because he's trying to simplify his life, to live deliberately, and to try to find a way to live apart in a way that reduces the amount of dependency on such a system of injustice. So I just wanted to add those thoughts to the conversation, and I'll get over to some of the questions that have come up. And one is, this is addressed to Antonio, Bergur, Henrik, and the question is, which of Thoreau's writings have been translated into your language?
Well, I can maybe answer first. Walden was first translated to Icelandic in 2017. So it's quite new, and it's a great translation. So I'm very proud of having this book in Icelandic. I just want to remind everyone about the conference we'll be having in Reykholt in Western Iceland in the year 2022, in the days from 25th to the 27th of May, about Thoreau. And the title is Thoreau's Time.
Great. Antonio, I know you've done some translating work.
Yes, well, as I said in the chat, right now, almost everything of Thoreau has been translated into Spanish, but the journal, of course, that's the big, white whale that all Thoreauians have to read in the original, which is a good thing, I think. The first thing to be translated into Spanish was Walden, at least partially, before the Civil War in the 20s. But then, I wanted to mention this, every time there is a crisis, as Bergur said, interest in Thoreau peaks. So we had that in different, in the Spanish political reform in the 70s, wow, it went up. And then again in the 2008 economic crisis, again. And right now, even these days, people are asking me about Thoreau. But to finish with the question, almost everything has been translated, and even the journal in bits and pieces has been translated into Spanish.
Right. Well, as for Sweden, I'd answer akin to Antonio. Very much by now is translated. We still lack The Maine Woods, A Yankee in Canada, and Cape Cod, or we have selections of the journals. Observation that the civil disobedience, for instance, was issued specifically in 1978 when we had a huge debate over the future of nuclear power in Sweden, and the translator and the editor and the publishers of civil disobedience were at that time convinced that Thoreau would be very much against nuclear power, and also the way, of course, it was sort of imposed against the popular will. So yes.
Thank you, Henrik. And just a few comments on Brian Bartlett's poetry. So I'll read those. Reading Brian Bartlett's Branches Over Ripples now. Highly recommended. Another person says, heartily agree with the recommendation of Branches Over Ripples. Another person says, Brian, that's the same edition of Walden that I bought in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1975. In keeping with Brian's point about Thoreau's gratitude, it's notable how many times in the journal Thoreau says, I love something. And then to the general group, can anybody think of a place where Thoreau speaks about hope? What did Henry have to say about hope? That things would get better? Question?
Can I just start it by saying that, because this came up in the wonderful discussion that Rochelle Johnson moderated with Kristen Case and Audrey, that Thoreau's constantly insisting, surely joy is the condition of life, which is in the Natural History of Massachusetts. And it's just a theme, I can't think of a moment where he just says, I'm going to step back and talk about hope. But that so much when we see him in despair, which we see a lot once we start to pay attention, we see this assertion of hope over despair. So I would just say I see it everywhere, even if I can't right now, and maybe I will after I get off the call, find a particular moment that's just perfect. And yes, I love that edition of Walden. But I just see it as something that's running throughout his work, even though sometimes he struggles, as we all do, to find that hope. So sorry, I was the moderator and I stuck my there, but I've been writing about it a little bit, so.
Very shortly, if I may add that, of course, he doesn't speak about hope explicitly, but all through Walden, there is the theme of desperation, desperate lives. And desperation is the opposite of hope. So if you look at it in the negative way, all he says about desperation is relevant concerning hope.
Thank you, Antonio. That was partly what I was trying to get at, for sure. Yeah.
That was a nice tie with Natural History of Massachusetts. So before we conclude, I would like Henrik and Bergur to let us know a little bit about our plans for Iceland. And then Becky, Rebecca can also have a chance to say something before we conclude. And then I'll have a few announcements at the end.
Bergur, should I say something? Would you like to start?
Well, I just wanted to say that I was very impressed with the conference in Gothenburg. It was a revelation for me. And it was, in a way, my entrance to the world of Thoreau. But because of Thoreau's interest for Snorri Sturluson, and I'm the director of this cultural center and research center, Snorrastofa, we came up with the thought of having a conference about Thoreau in Reykholt in Western Iceland. And now it's going to be in 2 years, in the end of May, 25th to the 27th of May. And then we could expand that time for some other activities on the 28th and 29th of May, copying the planning in Gothenburg. Can you say something about this topic, Henrik, about time?
I guess we will see, we would certainly welcome a broad range of presenters and topics involving both Thoreau's own concepts of time in the journal and elsewhere, also the time he was living through, which was very much one of transition, and as we all know, not very smooth transitions. Also, of course, related to our own times, which we associate with a lot with crisis when we think of the climate, for instance. So we hope for a broad range of attendees. That's our hope. We will follow the symposium sessions or other things going on, so that potentially on the conversation. So there will be speakers over the course of 3 days where everyone will have to join in if they so wish. And the end of May next one, but we postpone that further. I will say also that we are very, very happy to have solicited we have a pledge by Laura Dessel-Walls to act as our plenary during those days, which I think is a wonderful boon. On the Thoreau Society website shortly about this in
Thank you, Henrik. I know you have some announcements to make, Michael, and I also know that this is being recorded, so even though the people I'm speaking to are here, I think we've got 50 or so participants, you may still want to go back to the recording to read all the interesting stuff that's emerging in the chat, including more comments about hope, day, dawn, wakefulness. Again, I want to thank the panelists. I really learned a lot from you. This was like a rich, I don't teach graduate students, unfortunately, and this was like a rich graduate student seminar in many ways. So thank you so much. And thank you, Michael, for calling us all together in this way. And go ahead, make your announcements so that I don't keep people on too late, and then we can all gather again, I believe at 2.
Yes, thank you all. So this concludes today's session. We'll be coming back again at 2 p.m. where we will be discussing racism and disenfranchisement then and now. And that session is sponsored by Louisa May Alcott Orchard House. So I look forward to seeing people back again for that session. And my name is Michael Frederick. I'm the Executive Director of the Thoreau Society, and it's been a pleasure to host this webinar today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
See you soon. Take care, everyone.